Hey everybody, episode 4, White Seabass, spectacular. I have Chugey Sepulveda back, and he's joined by his fellow marine biologist Scott, Scooch, Albers. They know everything there is to know about white sea bass. They've been studying this fish for over 10 years, doing satellite tagging, acoustic migration, tracking, you name it, they've done it. So this is a very science-based pod. You know, we just delve into the white sea bass, which in my opinion is the most iconic of Southern California fish or game fish. And it's a really great episode. We had to record remotely because we're all self-quarantining and practicing social distance. So there's a few technical issues that hopefully we'll be able to iron out. But these guys were real cool to call in, take the time out of their day. And hopefully you'll learn a lot about one of the coolest fish that we are lucky enough to have here in our Southern California bite. And you know, once this quarantine lifts, you know, it's going to be just kicking off prime white sea bass season. And hopefully we'll all be able to get out there and enjoy what we love, which is fishing. And hopefully there's some light at the end of the tunnel, and we can just imagine getting out there and cranking on some big sea bass. So hopefully you enjoy. Sit back and take some notes on white sea bass. All right. Hey, guys. We're here doing our first coronavirus podcast, social distance podcast, remote podcast. I got Chugey back and Scooch, Albers. Guys are both marine biologists from PIER. Thanks for calling in.
Yeah, no, we're stoked to be here. This kind of breaks up the standard day of lockdown. So we're hopefully this the remote podcast works well and we can keep doing them.
Yeah, thanks for having us. And we're here in Oceanside, California. Glad to be talking to you.
I'm in my office at my house in Laguna, and I see pretty much all the way up to like Huntington Flats down to off Dana Point. There's not one boat out on the water. It's so crazy.
There's got to be a sea bass somewhere getting ready to spawn and getting ready to eat too. So I'm sure there's going to be a couple guys getting out there and practicing social distancing, but with a rod in their hand pretty soon.
Yeah, once this weather blows through, it's supposed to be a little breezy this week, but this is the time of year when they stack up on the beach and the islands, and you can get some pretty good bites in late March and April.
Well, especially in Laguna, since it's been closed now for 10 years within the MLPA, where, you know, I know there's some good sea bass spots in Laguna, and you know, those things are just got to be stoked that no one's out performing here.
Yeah, we've got some hydrophones monitoring adult white sea bass spawning up and down the coast. One in Laguna there, and one at PV, one at La Jolla, looking at spawning both inside and outside reserves. And so far, we haven't seen a big difference in spawning tendency in the reserve, but it definitely provides a little safe haven for them. And there's fish spawning off the coast right now.
Yeah, they can move pretty quick too. So
that brings up, you brought up the hydrophones, and you know, that's where you're able to kind of track the migration underwater by the croaking. Or how's that work?
Yeah, so the male white sea bass will produce sound during the spawning season to attract females into a spawning aggregation. And we record some of the sounds and are able to determine when and where fish are spawning up and down the coast based on the acoustic signal. So it's a real non-invasive way just to look at spawning off our coast and periodicity. So there's typically activity between March and August is when sea bass spawn along Southern California. And typically right after sundown is when you'll hear it the loudest. They're pretty vocal, pretty get these big low frequency booms and drumming that I'm sure a lot of the free divers are familiar with.
And then the croaking, is that to attract females, or is it to like show, you know, how elk or deer, like their antlers show that they're more virile? Is it like the bigger, badder sea bass have a bigger croak, or?
Exactly, lower frequency, more intensity, and but it does attract. They're kind of an aggregating species, so they they get into big groups to spawn. So it brings them all together and tells the females that potentially there's a good spawning area. So we've got 6 hydrophones up and down the coastline monitoring those sounds. And they produce a unique sound during the act of spawning. So you can actually tell when fish are spawning. Sounds almost like a machine gun going off underwater.
Do you have to put somebody in the water to go down and recover the recordings, or are you able to access them a different way? And then
It's a traditional diver in the water, but the situation's gotten way better over the last, 4 years, because we started this project probably 2008 or 9. And back then we were having to dive on the receivers every 14 days because the batteries wouldn't last and you'd fill up the memory. But now they can go the whole season. 2 dives, one at the beginning of the year. Scooch and Mike just dove a few days ago. They put the recorders in place, and probably beginning of August, they'll go to pick them up.
And the fish, the sea bass, how close do they have to be to the recorder to pick up the sound?
That low frequency travels a long ways underwater. So probably 2 kilometers, you can detect a fish when they're booming out that croaking.
That's crazy. So then do you guys go through and listen to the whole thing? I mean, there's got to be an easier way.
Yeah, there's some automated algorithms being put together with the machine learning software now that we're working with a few guys on. That's going to make the process a lot more straightforward. But up until now, it's been a lot of filtering and listening, manual ground truthing of the actual sounds. There's a lot of other non-white sea bass sounds too that you need to filter out just to try to isolate the signal that you're looking for.
Like whales and boats and...
Yeah, exactly. At this time of year, it's pretty noisy underwater, especially after dark. You get the midshipmen, the snapping shrimp, the whales, boats, all kinds of other croakers and sound-producing fish. So it's a little rock concert going on starting March, April, May. It gets pretty noisy.
And then what is the objective of trying to hear all that? Just to see
it's a non-invasive way to looking at presence and absence of spawning aggregations. So I think the traditional way is to set a gill net and harvest fish to see if they're reproductively ready. But that entails terminal sampling, which means you got to kill the fish to pull the gonads. And this is a little less invasive way of determining a similar thing.
Yeah, and early on, we had the question came up of whether or not sea bass spawn everywhere. Is it only certain locations? Is it the same spot every year? What's going on? And what we found is, to date, we're still looking at the data, and Scooch can talk a little more to this, but, we do see a lot of potential spawning activity at all of these sites every year. We definitely see waves of fish that move through, and then you'll have some periods where you don't have a lot of activity, then another batch will come through. So we're learning a lot about the habitat that they need for spawning, so that's one of the questions as well.
Maybe this is like a good time just to kind of do like a quick overview of the annual migration of the sea bass, like in terms of when they're not here spawning during the spring, and which is obviously the best time for fishing. The other 8 or 9 months, or as they're moving up and down the coast, are they going south in the winter and then coming back up here up north as the water warms up? Or you got populations that kind of hang out year round? Or what's kind of the brief overview on the populations?
This project ties in really good with our White Seabass archival tagging study, which we've also been doing since 2008. I think we put out 470 tags in adult wild-caught white seabass and studied their movement patterns up and down the coast. And that's tying in well with some of our other ongoing projects and learning a lot about white seabass movements. So yeah, I think we've got over 100 tags back so far, which is a battery-powered tag that rides around with the fish for a couple of years until somebody catches it. And we offer a $200 reward for the return of the tag. That tag can be downloaded to look at both horizontal and vertical movements of fish in the water column. So we do tend to see some seasonal movement patterns. We're still analyzing that data as well. There's so much of it. But we do see fish traveling all the way from Baja California up to Northern California and even beyond the Oregon border at times. That's more of a push in the summer and fall months as the water warms up. and then you seem to see them recede more to the south in the winter and spring months.
And then there's also some fish up in the Sea of Cortez, right?
Yeah, there's a disjunct. We think it's disjunct population over there, as well as fish all the way down to southern Baja, Mag Bay. They catch some white sea bass, and we are trying to ramp up some tagging down in southern Baja, but that still needs to be determined if that's a separate stock.
We think it probably is, just even if you just look at the past fisheries data, because back in the day when the stocks took a really hard hit, our U.S. boats, this is like pre-80s, our U.S. boats used to head down there. They'd head down to San Juanico and that region down below Abriojos, and they would still connect really well. That's where most of the landings were coming from, even when there wasn't much sea bass up here. And we see that also. The fish look a little different. They're a little smaller. We had some otolith microchemistry work done in the last couple of years, and it shows that there is some differences in the larval fish, in the early fish. So we do think that that's probably a different stock. But if it's from, I'd say, mid-Baja, so like Punta Eugenia, up to Arcos, up to San Francisco, we see a lot of movements between here and there. So it's interesting. I mean, because when I was a kid, we always thought that sea bass were kind of planted. You know, they just didn't bite when it was warm. Maybe they're down on the bottom, but they can definitely move. They can move a long ways real fast too.
Yeah, and it seems like the winter months, like you hear about guys getting the occasional big fish when they're halibut fishing or whatever. So it seems like there's still some fish around year round, but maybe just, not as active or, just more spread out. I mean, do you think there's a pretty good chance you could catch a sea bass, year round here if you really wanted to go out and put the time in?
Yeah, definitely. They tend to go a little deeper in the winter months, is what we've seen with the tagging data. So they're probably in different areas that you wouldn't necessarily see them come May and June. But likely they are off the coast, either here or north of here, during the winter months.
Yeah, and you look at the gillnet fisheries or even the rod and reel guys. Occasionally, they seem to have a trickle of fish. November, December, January, March, all the way through now, and then it starts shifting to more of a surface-based fishery. So there's some around. You really need if you want to target them with a rod and reel, you really need them aggregated. You need them kind of concentrated in a smaller area, which happens right around the spawning season. You get the spawning season and some squid mixed together.
Yeah, I mean, I think all the big like rod and reel bites where everyone gets grouped up and they get the long drawn out bites always seem to be like on squid nest. That's kind of what was going on last year, right? Up in the Northern Channel Islands, and you get that Catalina, you get squid nest bite.
Yeah, squid definitely stack them up. That gives them something to kind of plant an anchor for a few days or weeks. Whereas typically with our tracks, we'll see long periods where the fish are moving really long distances, and then shorter periods where they're setting up to feed and maybe spawn. So they have the potential to move thousands of miles every year, every season, but they will stop and dine on that easy prey source.
Yeah, remember a couple of years ago, Scooch, when we had those fish, they were coming off of they kind of planted off of San Onofre, and they were there for a couple months. And then all of a sudden, once the water warmed up, they moved up north, and then we started seeing some recaptures from the Monterey Bay area. It was that same cohort, too. It was like a lot of really large fish, between 40 and 50 pounds. They ended up taking roots up there right next to Monterey Harbor there, where a lot of them were recaptured up there.
Yeah, and that was a big squid area. We've also seen an interesting pattern of fish being recaptured years later in the same exact spot, even though they probably moved thousands of miles in between being recaptured and released. They'll come back to those spots, which are typically squid spawning areas, and get recaptured in the same zone.
It seems like the big, like 60, 70 pound fish are always caught along the coast. Like catching a 60 pounder in Catalina is virtually unheard of. I mean, there's a couple, obviously, exceptions to that. But how come the really big 60, 70 pounders that guys are getting along the coast, you're not getting those big ones out at the Channel Islands usually?
You want to take a crack at that one?
Yeah.
It could definitely be that different foraging types along the beach where you've got bigger prey sources, more finfish and maybe more a different abundance of prey, which attracts those larger fish. It could be a spawning habitat kind of thing, or I don't think they're necessarily different stocks of fish. There does seem to be some size segregation, though.
What's really cool, though, Chase, is so Paul was fishing with us probably about 6 years ago, and we were at, I think, Santa Rosa, and we talked about the same thing. We said, why do we never see any big ones out here? And then 5 minutes later, he caught a 72-pounder. 5 minutes after we talked, man. It was like, boom. It happens, but it's just much less frequent.
Yeah, it just seems like the average size of the island fish are much smaller than the average size. And vice versa. Like, you don't get a lot of the small guys catching the small schoolie size fish as much on the beach. And, I don't know if it's just the spots that guys like usually fish sea bass over here on the beach. They're not really like, in Catalina, if you're fishing like in that milky, shallow water, we'll get a lot of smaller fish where I guess on the beach here, guys don't really fish that style. I'm not really sure. This has always been one of those things that makes you scratch your head a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's the case, that we don't know for sure. It's all opinion, or, we can kind of use a little bit of the tagging data to figure out what's going on. But I wouldn't be surprised if you see a shift in behavior with age, because you're right. We see a lot more larger ones caught consistently along the beach. Even when a little squid's nest shows up along the beach, you can almost guarantee they're going to be bigger than the ones you see at the islands. And it may be, we do see a lot of them forage on finfish, so mackerel, sardine, and anchovy balls. We've pulled the calico bass and a lot of other blacksmith, large smelts, you name it, out of their guts, especially the ones on the beach. So it's probably the case that you see a shift in migratory patterns, but we don't know just yet. Thing is, they live for a long time. So some of these big tankers, they're 20 years old, and it's quite likely we probably are seeing some type of shift, but we haven't had enough data to really pinpoint exactly what's going on.
It was encouraging to see all those big spawners on the beach here. I guess that was 10 years ago now. We had really good fishing on the beach for big fish. 2008, 9, 10. We were seeing a lot of spawning, documenting spawning on the receivers, and thought that would lead to another good cohort of juveniles. But we haven't seen a lot of those smaller fish in the last few years. Maybe some out at the islands, but definitely not on the beach here. So that kind of begs the question of, where are the smaller cohorts, and it looks like maybe poor recruitment conditions might have been part of the issue there. Even though there was a lot of spawning going on, we weren't seeing those smaller fish make it into juveniles and into adults.
What's that mean, the recruitment?
So recruitment, it's kind of the transition between a sea bass going from an egg to a larvae and into a settled out juvenile fish. Usually that process takes a couple months. For them to hatch out, they spend a month or so in the planktonic surface waters, and then they recruit as juveniles to the bottom. And once they're, an inch or two long, they start feeding on different copepods and other benthic forage items. And you really need a good recruitment of that little juvenile stock to feed a good cohort of fish. So in saying that, I guess basically we haven't been seeing a lot of those smaller groups of fish, at least on the beach here, in the last 5 or 6 years.
Well, I think in general, there's been, you see little pockets of them, but no real big schools of the schoolies. I think last year there was the exception, a couple little spots around Santa Rosa and up there at Christie's. But it's been a few years. And what's a little scary is Mexico's seeing the same thing. Northern Baja has not been seeing really good fishing. We have a bunch of colleagues down there. We work with a bunch of fish camps. We have a graduate student that goes to the different fish camps, looks at catch rates, really trying to stockpile a lot of the smaller fish so we can see when they mature. And they're seeing the same thing. They're not seeing a lot of individuals. So they're definitely not just hiding below the border. One thing that was kind of interesting is we did hear the call this year. A lot of fish were being caught inside of San Francisco Bay, which is kind of cool. That's a kind of a long ways from here, but a lot of smaller fish being caught in the bay up there.
Yeah, it seems like one of the interesting things, like I guess the last like maybe 7 years for just fishing in general and the bite has seemed like, I don't know if it's the water temperatures or what, but like a lot of the pelagic fish, marlin and whatnot, swordfish has been, the fishing's been way better at the Northern Channel Islands, especially marlin. And then last year with the sea bass bite was way better up there. I wonder if that's just like a cyclical thing or if it's just a trend with the warming water and it's cooler up there or what that is. But it's definitely been kind of a trend the last few years.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we've seen that too. I think a lot of it has to do with the current patterns, because that earlier in the year we see the current kind of racing up towards Anacapa, and then it kind of spins around. I don't know, definitely a accumulation of resources up there. That's also been where a lot of the squid's been, and everything loves to eat squid. That seems to be a big driver.
The years when the market squid or there's more prevalent, it seems like the sea bass are obviously the bites equivalent to how good the squid fishing is, and seems like Catalina, at least the last couple of years, there's not been a ton of squid. Is that something that you guys are looking for, like when it comes to the like indicator for a sea bass year, the amount of squid and other forage fish?
Yeah, well, let me take it first, Scooch, and then you fill in. Because what's kind of interesting is that I remember what we did. Actually, your dad and Tom Pfleger, both of them pitched in to help out with the first stock assessment ever for sea bass. And one of the interesting things that came up, because that was one of the questions. Okay, do we see a lot more sea bass during squid years? What about sardine years? And trying to relate it to forage fish. What was pretty interesting is during squid years, we seem to see a higher recreational catch, and the commercial catch seems to be down, which at first you start scratching your head, but actually makes sense, because those gill netters, they can't fish inside of 3 miles, and a lot of your squid spots are inside of 3 miles. So once those fish kind of set up on squid spots, we think that might lead to like better targeting, I guess, for the recreational guys. They seem to be able to have greater success during squid bites, which we all know. I mean, that's, if you want to catch your first sea bass, try to find a squid spot and anchor up and be patient. Along the beach is a lot more difficult, but there's a lot of other trends, especially with sardine abundance, that are they're pretty interesting. But I don't know, maybe you could fill in, Scooch, with regards to the sardine abundance, because that's something that has us also thinking about it.
Both the sardine and squid obviously fluctuate quite a bit year to year. Sardine biomass has been down a lot the last 3 to 4 years, and same with the squid. So we do think, and Tom is a real proponent, a believer, that the sea bass are following the sardines. I know that they're relative off South Africa. They follow the sardine migrations down there, so they're a big driver of they're the primary forage fish for that subspecies, or it's a different species of the same genus that white sea bass are related to. And they follow those big waves of sardines. I think the fish do here as well that sardine is a primary forage for them, but the squid is definitely a preferred easy meal, especially on the squid spawning grounds where they're easy to vacuum off the bottom, easy protein source. But like Chugey mentioned, that squid spawns inshore inside of typically 20 fathoms, so makes it harder for the gill nets to access that resource, and typically aggregates our recreational fishing effort onto those spots. So once the word gets out on a good spot of squid, it's not long before guys are usually catching sea bass there, especially in April, May, June.
Yeah, and then after June 15th, I don't know, I'd say the last 5 years has been a pretty big surge in rod and reel commercial fishing on those squid spots, because those guys can catch quite a few. If that nest is mature and it's set up and there's not a lot of bait seining, I mean, they can really catch quite a few.
That brings up an interesting thing with the commercial fishing that I was curious about. You mentioned gill nets and you mentioned rod and reel. Are those the two like methods of commercial fishing only, or is there any other sort? And then with the gill nets, you said they have to be 3 miles off the beach. Explain to me like how the commercial gill net operation works and how those guys are targeting sea bass.
From our tag recapture data, we get tag recaptures back from a number of different groups, primarily commercial hook and line, commercial gill net, but also quite a few recreational hook and line and spear fishermen. So it seems to be pretty well spread. We've gotten over 100 of our tags back from, it's a 25% recapture rate. So a pretty high recapture rate on adult fish, all from different groups, but primarily the commercial hook and line and set gill net as well, both in Mexico and the U.S. In Mexico, they're not prohibited from fishing inshore with the net, but since 1994, off California, there's been a 3-mile restriction off the coast and 1 mile off the islands to gill net fishing for white sea bass. So they're allowed to fish commercially from June 15th through March 15th. That's when we typically see some of the best fishing, right after that June 15th opener is kind of coincides with a pretty good push of fish through our area typically.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that one thing listeners probably would like to hear is, I've always thought that the commercial fishery lands way more than the recreational fishery, but it's not the case. It fluctuates year to year. Some years you have a higher recreational take, and that's just estimated because we don't know exactly what the take is, but some years you have a higher recreational, some years you have a higher commercial. So it does fluctuate back and forth. And our tag data says that. The recaptures show that exactly. If you look at a pie chart, and they're all pretty much the same. I mean, they're broken down. We even have some spear fishermen in there too. So we've had quite a few recaptures, and it's a good talking point because when you talk about sea bass conservation, if one user group takes a lot more than the other, they always point fingers. But when everybody's kind of splitting the pie evenly, then they all start saying, "Oh, okay, well, we need to take care of this. We can't just blame someone." It's been a good tool for us, at least reaching out to both recreational and commercial guys.
But with the gill nets, like if they're having to put them offshore, like how does that work? Like where do they like just putting them out in the middle of nowhere? I mean, I guess guys, you don't think of sea bass being 3 miles offshore. Are they setting up on like the Cortez Bank or stuff like that? Or it just seems weird that would be like a effective way to catch sea bass.
There seems to be a few offshore corridors as well as on the beach. There's some areas, the flats, where the shelf drops off really slow, and the sea bass will tend to pipe along those corridors in the summer months. So I think the net fishing used to occur a lot more inshore, but since it was moved outside of 3 miles, guys have figured out some spots where they can consistently catch that fish as it moves up the line, both around the islands as well as out at Cortez Bank and some of the flats here, San Pedro Flats.
Yeah, and I think also the fleet's pretty small. There's just, I don't know, if I were to take a guess, you're not looking at hundreds of gill netters. You're actually looking at probably only, what do you think, Scooch? It's just a couple handfuls, probably
30 or so, I'd say, that are active.
Yeah, and a lot of those guys just fished a week to 2 weeks right after the opener. That's when they usually end up making a good score, and then they hang it up. Like you said, there's not a lot of real estate out there, and what real estate there is, that's where you see almost all the activity. So right down by the border, and then out towards the Cortez and a few other areas, but most of the activity in the past was really just tight in the beach, right along the kelp, just like you see. If you go down to Baja, you start driving down towards San Quintin, you hug every one of those kelp beds during this springtime. Actually, probably next month through July, you're going to see nets, that net materials right in there, tucked in. Every single one of those kelp beds usually has a few nets on it.
Yeah, I'm looking at the landings for the commercial and recreational comparisons. And I mean, obviously looks like 2008, there was a huge discrepancy between commercial and recreational. Commercial catching tons more. And then you get down to like 2014, it was about the same. And then it's kind of gone down since then. So yeah, I think that's a good point. I think as a recreational guy myself, we always look at like, oh, how come we're only allowed to keep one or two, and then the commercial guys are out here just whacking them left and right. And I think sometimes, not all the time, but a lot of times that it isn't as big a discrepancy as guys think. And yeah, it's a good point.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, there's been a pretty steady decline both in recreational and commercial takes since around 2010. That's what the stock assessment shows, and unfortunately, we're seeing the same trend in Mexico, as Chugey mentioned. So numbers are down. I think as rec guys, we realize that it's harder and harder to get those big scores. Putting tags out for us has been more challenging every year. 2008, we had no problem getting 40 tags in the water, and now we struggle to get 20 per season. So you don't seem to be seeing as big a groups setting up, even when you do find a good spawning or squid bed.
Yeah, and it only lasts a day or two. I don't know if that's the social media in action, but man, there's no secrets anymore. So when a little bite sets up, it's just a couple days, and then you got a parking lot, which happened in the past, but used to take a little more time. It's definitely a lot quicker. People are a lot quicker to respond nowadays.
Those numbers coincide with the bluefin showing up here, and the bluefin bite's been starting to happen in the spring, and I just wonder, a lot more guys are targeting bluefin instead of putting the focus on the sea bass, and maybe that's like part of the reason we're seeing the lower numbers too.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, Scooch and I talk about this all the time. There's nothing like something else to show up to take pressure off of them. And the same thing, believe it or not, we have the same conversations back maybe, I don't want to sound like an old man, but like 12 years ago, 15 years ago, with regards to the thresher sharks. I mean, there was some periods where there was nothing around, so everybody piled on them. But the second bluefin, yellowtail, anything shows up, then everybody just kind of skips it and drives right past them. So yeah, I do think that happens a lot of times. Thing is, that the sea bass have this allure, man. We always talk about this. There's a lot of money and time and effort spent just to go catch one fish, and actually people high-fiving and all stoked over one fish, which is that's sea bass. I mean, if you could only go catch one yellow, no one leave the dock,
Yeah, I think for me personally, growing up on Catalina, the sea bass has always been kind of sought after game fish on the Catalina for sure, and it still is for most guys over there. But I think for the average Joe, when these bluefin showed up, that guys thought, just something from the history books, that we would never sing like those big 200-300 pound tuna here in our local waters ever again. The fact that those fish are here, I think guys are just like, forget sea bass. I want to go and catch a 300-pound bluefin. And I mean, I've noticed definitely like a shift from guys that were hardcore sea bass guys that have gotten sucked into the bluefin thing big time.
Well, I mean, think about it, man. There's sometimes, I mean, I'm kind of jaded, but sometimes staying up all night sucks.
Yeah.
If you could just
come back from a sea bass trip feeling good, like not like
bluefin are a lot more visual, a lot more exciting, and a lot they bite at a more opportune time of the day typically.
Oh yeah, and you get someone who's kind of into it, and you take them out there and they're looking at a foamer, and you're either putting up your kite or getting your poppers out there, getting ready to get a backlash. That's pretty exciting. Or you could sit there and have someone soaking a bait all night long, waiting for that magic hour to happen. It can be pretty tough. Usually it's going to be cold. It's going to be damp. Oh man. Yeah. I'd like the bluefin thing sounds a lot more appealing.
Yeah. I mean, I think you get the full Nat Geo bite on the flying fish. You get to see like the huge blow up. You got the foamers. I mean, you're fishing during the day, it's over at when the sun goes down, you go in, you have a barbecue, you hang out, drink beers, go to bed. It's like sea bass fishing's brutal, man. I mean, it's like you don't get to sleep. So I can see why a lot of guys hate fishing sea bass. It's pretty kind of a hardcore fishery. If you want to have success, you need to be
patient.
Yeah, early things, and you have to catch squid a lot of times, which is, a whole nother part of it. And, it's tough.
Yeah, we've spent a lot of days and nights, sleepless nights, chasing them around and looking to put tags out. So yeah, 2 nights in a row is usually about the max you can put in before you need a break.
But all of us have been also there where you have that stupid, crazy, wide open bite that just changes everything. And you're like, holy, everything you put down, just boom, boom, boom. Whether it's on a balloon, whether it's on the bottom, and you're just thinking, holy cow, this is awesome. Then things go back to reality where it's a lot more sit, wait, be very, very patient. There's a few guys out there though, man. There's a few guys that are really patient, really patient. All of us know a couple of them. We're just like, man.
And those guys are, they generally score every year because they put in the most time.
Yeah, persistence as well as knowing what to look for a little bit and pounding those hot spots. That's what it takes. A lot of times we'll fish 4 or 5 trips for nothing, and then you get your 20 tags out in one shot when they do decide to really bite good. So you just got to keep the persistence.
Now, when you guys have a tagging project going, are you generally waiting later in the spring when it gets going full speed? Or is this about the time of year, early April when you start thinking about it, or is this still too early?
I'll start, Scooch, and then you finish up. But initially, Chase, back in the day when we were a lot less tuned up, we'd start pretty early. I mean, we'd start like whenever when's your birthday, Scooch? It's like
early April, yeah.
Early April, we'd start, and every year it's same thing, man. You pound and pound and pound and pound. You get one, and then come June, then you have a 20 fish day or 25 and 15, and you're like, okay, we got them all out. But it seems to be a lot better later on. So we're doing a lot more waiting now.
Yeah, I mean, you always hear of somebody catching 1 or 2 or a little bite happening early spring, and it's real easy to jump at those and get the boat out and thinking it's gonna be good, and a lot of times missing more than not, and then you look back and you thought maybe we should have just waited until June.
Yeah, I think also that it seems like right around Fred Hall, all the rumors are kind of going around. Everybody's kind of like getting ready to go. But as long as the conditions are pretty unstable, when you still have wind events happening and the water rolling, man, things are really variable. They can be there and they don't need to bite.
Yeah. The spawning starts in March, but it really ramps up in May and June. I think when they're spawning a lot, they also need to feed a lot, so to replenish. So I think the two kind of go hand in hand. You see a peak in spawn kind of late May or mid-June. Yeah, and that seems to coincide with some of the better bites off our coast.
What about the squid spawning? Does that coincide with the sea bass spawning, but they both go at the same time?
The squid are more year-round spawners, I think. They can spawn anytime, winter, summer. You see them. I mean, the commercial squid guys know them the best, but they can't spawn year-round as far as I know.
Yeah, and I think that when we really do see them, it's really during the spawning window for sea bass. So May, June, like the peak, May and June, when it does happen to line up with a bed or with a squid spawning spot, that's when a lot of numbers can be put on the board. A lot of guys. I mean, right there off San Onofre, they caught a lot of fish in just a few weeks, or actually it was probably a couple months, but happened a couple years in a row.
I got in on that bite, and that was really just so much fun because it was anchor up on the spot, and then you get the nightly swim through, and those were big fish. Like those were 50s. Average I think was around 50, but it seems to me like at least I'm a Catalina fisherman. I dabble on the coast, but it seems like those big squid nests on the coast, or is that more of a rarity than the big squid nests on the island, or is that something that happens all the time and it's a matter of guys finding them?
Well, it's really hard for a squid to go unnoticed in Southern California along the beach, but it's pretty common to have the squid beds up north. So Point Conception, up all the way to Monterey. A lot of our squid gets caught up that way, especially the Channel Islands. So I think it really varies year to year on the conditions. And I don't know, the last 3 or 4 years, it seems like the bulk of the squid has been around the Channel Islands there, Anacapa, Santa Cruz, Santa Rosa. And that's probably why we haven't seen the big hits along the beach here. I know that occasionally someone catches a few fish at the reef or along the beach here somewhere, or PV, and then they seem to be gone. I think that they're moving probably, and they don't have that forage to really anchor them in one spot, like Scooch was mentioning.
They can move a long way when there's nothing to stop them. So they're traveling all the way up to Northern California, is what we're seeing with some of these tracks. So
yeah, and I think that I don't even know if we mentioned this, but it's hard to believe that some of those bigger sea bass, they're 20 years old. They're those big 50, 60 pounders. They're right around there. So
that was one of the things I had jotted down was interesting to me when I first learned about how old like a big sea bass is. Can you guys kind of just start with like a 10 pound, or maybe just start with like what a 28-inch legal sea bass, their age, and then work up kind of like age wise?
They seem to grow really fast the first 3-4 years of life, especially as juveniles. They can put on a lot of length in a hurry. It was initially thought that they reached a 28-inch size around 4 to 5 years, which was put in place for the minimum size limit. That's the size that it was. There was a study down in 1930 that showed that was the size of maturity for white sea bass. So that's what the regulation was based on. We've revisited that a little bit and found that older study was based on a very small number of fish and didn't really represent the population well. So what we're seeing is that a 28-inch male is in fact mature, but females are a little bit bigger and older before they start spawning, more like 7 years. So I'd say a 10 pounder, yeah, you're looking at a 4-year-old. 15 to 17 pounders, like well,
it depends if they're male or female, right? So that's the main thing. I mean, what's a 28-inch fish is probably like 7.5, 8 pounds, right, Scooch? That's a legal one. So if it's a male, it may be 4 or 5 years old, but if it's a female, it may be 6 or 7. And that's the work we're doing right now in the lab. We're trying to figure out size of maturity for the females. That's really important when it comes to stock assessments and being able to manage the stock. You just need to know at what size they start spawning. And we don't know if this is going to directly mean, okay, we need to petition the managers to change the size limit, because you have to also consider, okay, well, a lot of these fish are going to get caught. How many get released and don't make it? So these are some, but fortunately now there's some models, there's the same program that was used to do the stock assessment can take into all these variables into consideration and help us figure it out. But it is right now, the crazy thing is that once they hit sexual maturity, we don't see them growing very fast. We have a lot of fish where we'll tag a fish that's 40 inches long. Let's say it weighs 44, 45 pounds in the spring. And the next year it's recaptured and you're thinking, oh, it's going to be a lot bigger. And it's almost identical. It hasn't moved. It hasn't changed that much. It's just that they're not putting on that much length once they get older. That largest one ever aged, Scrooge, that was that 94 pounder, right? Was that?
Yeah, I think it was 29 years old, and it was 63 inches long. So you can catch a 60-incher that's only 60 pounds, but a 63-incher was 93 or 90 some pounds. So that just shows that they really slow down on the length growth as they get larger. That curve really tapers off, and it's harder to age those older fish, believe it or not. The otoliths get blurred, and so we think it's about 30 years old, but it could be even older. As Chugey said, we're seeing a lot of recaptures that have been out for 5 years, and they haven't put on a lot of size. They're putting most of their energy into egg production at that size. So they're not putting the biomass on as quickly, and they can lose weight during the spawning season. They'll go from a 50 pounder down to, maybe lose 5 pounds over that spawning season as they shed all the eggs. And then they really need to replenish in the late summer and fall. That's probably why they're starting to feed a lot more.
And are you seeing like that the females get way bigger than the males? Like, do the males peak at a certain weight and then like they don't get bigger than that, or the females can?
Yeah, exactly. It's same with a lot of fish. The females are definitely bigger in general. It's rare to catch a male over 50 pounds. And if you do catch a 50-pound male, you're gonna hear it. It's a really intense, loud croaking sound when you put them on the deck. They can really boom out the sound at that size. But yeah, typically over 50 pounds, you're looking at a female.
Interesting. So that does then kind of go with the, falls in line with other fish where the females are much bigger than, because I think with like marlin, I think they say over 300 pounds, the males kind of stop at 300. And then so all those big granders and everything are all females. I was just curious if with sea bass, if there was like a kind of a set number where anything over this weight, okay, that's a female for sure.
Yeah, we used to always say anything over 40 pounds was going to be a female. And I remember just a couple of years ago, we had a 50-pound male, or 48 or something. So it's just pretty rare. We see a lot of the males maxing out probably in the high 30s, 40 pounds. And then the really large ones, though, the 60-pounders, we've never seen a male that's that size. But, anything's possible, but it's just the number of individuals you see that larger range are usually almost all female.
One of the things that you've mentioned a few times, and I think I mentioned it once, was the otoliths and being able to discern like the age of the fish by the otoliths. Like, kind of, can you explain what they are for people that don't know what an otolith is, and then kind of like how you guys use them to age the fish and different stuff?
Yeah, so the otolith is what guys call the stones or the ear bones that you pull out of the head. They're big white. In white sea bass, all fish have them, but white sea bass are really enlarged, and they function for hearing as well as orientation of the fish. They're kind of like the inner ear of the fish that can tell if they're rotating or moving three-dimensionally. But it also helps them hear better, and that's probably why they're so large in a white sea bass, because they're a very vocal species. Those ear stones with all fish, are used for aging purposes. So basically, you cut them down real narrow with a diamond saw, and then look at them under a microscope to count the rings like you would on a tree. We've done a couple studies with colleagues in Ensenada looking at age and growth of white sea bass, and that's kind of where we got that length to weight curve we were talking about earlier, where you got a 28-incher is about a 4-year-old, and then you got a 40-incher that's like a 7-year-old, and you got a 50-incher or 50-pounder that's pushing 20 years old. So they really slow down in that length to age curve.
And right now, one of the projects we have going is trying to validate the age. So what we're doing is catch the fish, measure them very carefully. Actually, Tom's been the kind of pioneer with this, where he's been doing a lot of this for us. Catch the fish, measure it, put it on the deck, and then you inject them just with an antibiotic in the gut cavity. You just squirt a little bit in there, depending on the size of the fish. You inject them with the antibiotic, tetracycline. You release the animal, and that's supposed to mark the otolith, so you know exactly when you can see that signature or that band on the otolith. And then all we want to do is validate that it's 1 ring per year. Some fish, it's 1 ring per year. Sometimes you'll see 2. You just want to make sure that we're using the rings, that we're using the rings in the right way, that we know exactly what each ring represents. There's daily rings, there's monthly rings, and sometimes there'll be annual rings.
I sat in on a talk about aging for marlin, and they were, I don't know if I remember right, but I think they were doing the rings on maybe
first
like the
dorsal spine.
Dorsal spine.
Yeah,
that's what it was. And then but the problem was the validation part. I think part of the question was whether or not each ring was a year, and I don't think they had done any validating I think it's a much, it's obviously harder with billfish. But so have you guys recovered any of the fish that you've tried to do this with? Or
Yeah, we're stoked. We got our first one back. So with, like, you're right. This type of validation study could be almost impossible if you're looking at a fish like a striped marlin, blue marlin, black marlin, where you have a really low recapture rate. But since our sea bass seem to come back to the same haunts every year, and we have a pretty high recapture rate, I think we have about a 23-25% recapture rate. We put on the tag that you need to keep the whole fish for a reward. And we got our first one back last year. It was out at Liberty for just about a year. So we have one back. We'd like to see about 2 or 3 more. But yeah, so we're stoked. We're actually going to try to analyze that data here this coming year. Some colleagues in Mexico that did the aging work, they have the otolith now, and they're going to polish the stone, cut it, and see if we can't know exactly what each one of those bands looks like.
so if that was successful, say that the otolith grew 1 ring past the marker, that would be pretty big, right? Then it would kind of prove that is a scientific or a reliable way to age a fish, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that'd be a good thing. And like you were mentioning with the blue marlin and some of the other tunas and other species, their otoliths are so small that it's sometimes hard to work on an otolith for aging. Sometimes some species you have to use a dorsal fin spine or another hard part on the animal because the otoliths are so small and fragile and hard to remove. But with the white sea bass, it's easy to pull them out.
Yeah, and our colleagues in Mexico have a pretty cool way of pulling the stones without even disrupting the head at all. They can go in from underneath the jaw there. They just go in with a pair of pliers and they pull them out, and the fish looks like it would normally at a market. So that's kind of helped out things as well.
I've never seen that method. Only seen the hacksaw method. I got to learn that. That'd be cool.
Yeah, it's actually a lot faster too, believe it or not. And it keeps the fish value up. So that way we can sample from the commercial markets.
So let's talk. I think we've covered a lot of the science part. Let's talk about some fishing tactics. I know, you guys are out fishing probably as much as anyone. It seems like one thing that's cool about these fish is there's like the island method, there's the coastal method, and then there seems like there's the Mexico method where it's like it's the same fish, right? But geographically everyone fishes them differently. I guess probably the most interesting thing for people might be kind of how you guys fish for sea bass in Mexico, because it's not like anything that we do up here. Maybe kind of explain how they're getting them down there and what that's like.
Well, I could tell you one thing. I love fishing in Mexico for sea bass. It's one of the few places that a bald bear crocodile can drum up a bite, man. That's one of my favorite go-tos, just a straight crocodile. It's like, who would have thought?
I'm being more specific, like with the bird school style of sea bass fishing there.
Yeah, that's where you definitely realize sea bass don't just eat squid. They're on the anchovy balls, they're on the sardine balls, they're on the mackerel. And usually the birds are a good indication of those bait balls, as you see, with your tunas and yellowtail up here. And you'll see bird piles up here that are holding sea bass. It's just seems to be more apparent down in northern Baja.
What's your game plan like on a day down there? You get up, and then do you just start heading offshore looking for birds, or what's the tactic?
Yeah, I think birds and bait, and as you know, if you do find birds and bait, you're usually not just finding white sea bass, but you got your barracuda, your calicos, sand bass. There's a lot of other, I'm going to call incidental catches, which makes it even more fun. You might not even catch a sea bass, but you'll go home with a few bass and barracuda and bonito and yellowtail. They all seem to kind of mix together, even with the marine mammals down there.
Yeah, and I think that's when I was going back to the crocodile. What we see is when sea bass are on fin fish like sardines, anchovy, mackerel, they seem to get a little more aggressive, and they're actually chasing down iron. They're chasing down a big plastic. Plastics are a lot of fun to use. you could throw plastic a lot up here and probably not get a bite. But down there, when they're clued in on schooling fish, it can drum up a bite, and so can an iron. It's a lot of fun, and it's really good when, like Scooch says, when you have all of that mix going on. You have yellowtail in there, barracuda in there, some bonito. That's usually when we start seeing sea bass. That has really tapered off, though, the last few years. It's really slowed down. Last year, I think there was still some action up for St. Quentin. We made a trip down there. We caught a few. We tagged a few, I don't know, in the summertime, but it was a lot better fishing a few years ago. Hopefully, we'll see that change this year. It has a lot to do with that bait and whether or not that bait's up and all the other species are feeding on it, kind of bunching it all up together.
Yeah, I think like with a lot of fishing, competition drives it. So when you got other stuff trying to eat your bait ball, the sea bass get a little more aggressive.
And are you seeing I've never done that style of fishing for sea bass. So when you guys are rolling up on a bait ball, is there any surface sign of a sea bass, or is it everything below the surface and you're just seeing the birds and maybe some bait?
A lot of times we actually see them, which is kind of cool. Yeah, when they're right at the surface, a lot of times you'll actually see them. But it's just like usually, if the fishing is really good, it's usually a pretty good party at the surface there. You got, pelicans and terns and gulls and everything going off. Then again, we've had other times where they're a little more lazy, but they're still climbing onto an iron here or there. And it just takes a lot of patience, a lot of casting all day long, which is something that we're not used to doing up here.
Yeah, that's where it's a little more exciting for someone who doesn't have that that patience like myself. I have a hard time sitting on the anchor for more than a couple hours, so it's kind of nice to be a little more mobile and moving around, looking at different kelp beds or different bird piles. I kind of like that style.
Yeah, me too. But I do think, even though you mentioned there's different styles, we've definitely seen that all of the styles can work in all of the places. If you fish them like you do at Catalina down along northern Baja, you can still catch fish. And just like you can along the beach, it's just you start gravitating towards different methods when it's a lot of times, if it's a little more fun, like Scooch does, you're actually moving. You're actually kind of chasing down something, going to bird pile to bird pile, or not just sitting in one spot.
If you talk to some of the local serious sea bass fishermen on Catalina, they'll swear to you that fin bait does not work for sea bass there. Like, the mackerel on the crocodile with like a balloon, or I don't know if it's just folklore or urban legend, but I obviously these sea bass are how do you say it, like opportunistic, right? So they'll they're not super picky. I would imagine they would eat a mackerel, or because I know there was a minute where like using a blacksmith was like that was the hot ticket.
Yeah,
it was harder to catch a blacksmith than it was to catch a sea bass. I don't know. How do you guys feel about that kind of?
Yeah, I recall a couple of years when squid were pretty skinny around Catalina, and I caught some fish on sardine and mackerel, so it's not impossible, that's for sure. And I think it's just like anything in fishing, you can never say something doesn't work, because you'll always be proven wrong.
But I do think that, there's something to say for it, because when they get clued in on something, we see them have a tendency to stay with it. You always hear guys, match the hatch or whatever. And it's just like you get a marlin year where they're climbing on the jigs and they're not really, you don't have you're not catching many on bait, or vice versa. It all depends on what they're eating. And there's a lot of really good fishermen out there that'll try everything. And then there's other guys that know, hey, this is going to work when I see them. So when it's presented to them. So you got two different schools there. And I don't think one is better than the other. One probably has more patience, though. One group of those guys has a lot more patience. If you have live squid somewhere, you'd be almost foolish not to be using it. It's a good bait.
But even like what you said with the live squid, like I can think of like last year, it's like guys on the beach were coming, or guys were going to the Catalina and making squid or buying squid, and then coming back over here, and guys be like, they're not eating the squid, they're only eating the mackerel or whatever. And I think that's one of the funniest things about sea bass fishing is every year something is the hot thing. It's like the crocodile with the live mackerel or the salmon buoy or salmon, with the thing for a minute. It's always changing. But I mean, for me personally, I'll take a dropper loop and 2 live squid any day of the week, regardless.
Yeah, that's the standard go-to. And if you got the patience for it, that's the way to go.
What happens though too is you get a lot of other stuff, when the quote unquote junk gets in the way. I mean, sometimes you can't keep a squid down. That's what drives you to start using other stuff.
That's a good point, because that for me is one of the most aggravating things about sea bass fishing is when you're getting just hammered by the junk and then you can't keep your squid. But sometimes, that's like where the guys that are persistent, seem to have a lot of success because they'll grind it out, and eventually a sea bass will swim through and they'll have success.
What's really frustrating is when you just paid $60-$80 for your scoop of squid, and you got like 100 baits in there to use, and then every single one of them is getting pounded by a small calico. And a lot of times that's what just drives you crazy. It's like over and over and over again. You can burn through the bait, and it's probably just a matter of time till the school swims through or something changes, but it takes a lot of patience.
For like Catalina, when you get those swim throughs where, let's say, you get, I don't know, such as, for example, you have a dozen boats anchored up somewhere on the Palisades on a nest, and then everyone's sitting there twiddling their thumbs, and all of a sudden you'll see, one guy's bent, and then everyone kind of had a chance, and then the fish are gone. What do you guys think's going on? Are the fish kind of just swimming around making their way with the current, swimming around, or they kind of pass through and then keep moving on, or what's going on a swim through situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think white sea bass are good low light predators, so they prefer those lower light hours, which is why a lot of times those swim throughs will be early morning, right at gray light. We see in the tagging data that their vertical movements definitely increase right around dusk and dawn. So you're probably seeing more movement up and down in the water column, probably related to feeding or spawning. So those are typical good windows to fish, but also, we've seen it happen at noon as well. So it's hard to say. It could be a tide shift. That's what a lot of guys hang their hat on. Shift in current. Current's definitely a driver. Certain spots bite better on different currents. So when you get your downhill current at your favorite spot, that could turn on the bite. That definitely gets the prey stacking up differently when the current changes. The bait will shift around a little, and that could start the bite.
What's kind of cool about Catalina is I've seen several times, I'm sure you have too, Chase, everybody's fished there a lot, where it'll switch, right? You have your sea bass go through, and everybody either has a chance or they catch one or two, and then sometimes then it's yellowtail.
Yeah.
And everybody's like boom, 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 everybody is stoked, and then it really slows down, and then maybe you get a halibut or even black sea bass move through, and that's one thing that's pretty cool. We've seen that, and that's like the perfect day when you have the whole spectrum go underneath the boat.
That's what makes it so fun, is when you have that sort of a deal. And I think Catalina, for sure, the current's huge. If you get that ripping downhill current anywhere along the backside, like, you're like, okay, at least you're like optimistic. When, obviously there's exceptions like with everything, but when you don't have a current, it seems like the fish just aren't active. I mean, you can get fish, but that downhill current seems to be good over there for sure. I think, and all along the coast, really.
Yeah, that seems to turn it on a lot more times than not. As current's off the beach and you're thinking, oh, it's not going to happen, and then you get a shift and things start to liven up a lot. So
what are you guys' plans for this year? Do you have any more sea bass?
No, we're hoping this Corona thing blows over, and then no one comes down with it. And once things sort out a little bit, we do hope to put out some of the validation work, the tetracycline tagging. We have a graduate student there in Ensenada, Cicese. his focus is going to be looking at white sea bass movements and some of the tagging work and really quantifying the fisheries below the border. So he's eager to start, but man, we're really hoping that this doesn't hinder all of that work. That work's probably going to be in June. And Scooch has been busy in the lab, really looking at the age and growth work. He's been doing a lot of looking at the gonads from all the fish we collected last year. Collected, I don't know, probably about 80 fish between like 27 and 32 inches, 60, 80 fish. So we're trying to go through those, and we actually have to send the gonads out and get them processed and look under a scope to validate whether or not, or make sure that they're mature. So a lot of sea bass work. It's usually happening between now and July, but right now it's pretty difficult to do anything.
Yeah, I think it's going to be, interesting with so much unknown about the coronavirus, like what effect it's going to have on, I think on one hand, fishing seems like a good way, something like an activity that you could actually do without having too much contact with anyone else, especially if you have your own boat, like party boats and stuff like that. It seems like we're like a ways before they're going to be able to have, 60 guys rail to rail on a cattle boat. It'll be interesting to see how this kind of impacts, at least the sea bass season, because that's, right around the corner. So
it's going to be a different year, that's for sure, because our industry is one of the few that you can stack a lot of people on the boat. The Landing Sea Center, the San Diego boats, I mean, they're all going to be really hurting over the next month or two, especially. And hopefully this can get sorted out so we can resume normal activity, because I do agree it's kind of problematic when you have 50 guys on the boat, all a few inches from each other. So hopefully this gets sorted out so we can get back to normal springtime, early summer fishing. It sounds like the bluefin's been around, so that's going to be exciting, but only if you can get outside and actually enjoy it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I've already had one fishing tournament canceled, and I think, it just sounds like it's just going to be a different year for sure. And hopefully sooner or later we'll be able to get back to some sense of normalcy and guys can get out fishing, be on the water.
Yeah, for sure.
Thanks for calling in, for doing our first Corona cast. And we'll have to check back in, when things settle down a little bit and maybe we're able to all get out and start fishing this year. And just, I guess, one last note, do you guys, what's your sense for this year in terms of sea bass? You think it's going to be kind of slow again, or are you guys seeing any sign that maybe a decent year?
What do you think, Scooch? I don't know. It's kind of the magic. You tend to pick up the magic 8 ball. It's hard to say right now.
Yeah, I've heard of a few fish caught already, but that's pretty typical for March. So it seems to be starting out about normal, average. And last year we had really good fishing around the northern Channel Islands there and up above Point Conception. So I don't know. Hopefully we'll see some fish a little farther south this season. Water temperatures are pretty good right now. They like that low 60s. 62 to 64 is kind of when I like to go. So that's a good time to start looking.
Yeah, so we'll see. Hopefully, you never know. That's the great thing about sea bass. It could be there right now, and no one's chasing them. No one's floating them over a bait. But yeah, Chase, thanks for having us here. And if anyone wants to read more about the work we're doing here at PIER, you can go to our website. Honestly, most of the sea bass work is funded through Tom, and your family's been a really big help too. So we're hoping to continue the work, and I'd like to see a time when we can all just go out and catch a sea bass without having to stay awake for 3 weeks in a row. So thanks for having us on.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, guys. And, you guys are doing awesome work. And I encourage anyone that's curious about this stuff to pop on their website and read some of the papers. It's really interesting if you care about the science and more specifics on our fish.
Yeah, and we got another paper coming out on our sea bass tagging south of the border. We've seen quite a few cross the border, so they don't seem to stick to U.S. or Mexican nationality. So that's one important finding, that we kind of need to co-manage that resource with Mexico. And And we're planning to do some more tagging in Mexico this year, working with CSSA and a few of the professors and grad students down there. So it's always an evolving line of work.
Awesome. Well, stay healthy, guys, and stay safe. And thanks for calling in, and we'll check back with you guys soon.
Yeah, thank you, Chase.
Have a good one. Thanks.